He did not romanticize solitude. He did not claim it was noble or edifying. He managed it, period. He kept his head full of tasks, occupied by the concrete details of survival, checking traps with an accountant's rigor, analyzing the thickness of the ice, calculating the wood supply. A discipline one can only sustain if one truly, deeply respects what the land is capable of doing to you. When winter sliced the days into thin ribbons and stretched the nights into eternity, he learned the tricks that keep you from thinking your way into error. Melting just enough snow to stay hydrated without burning tomorrow's precious fuel. Repairing what can be fixed before it breaks. Resting before distress, not after. Because the land, for its part, forgives no lapse, compensates for none. And his work precisely grew in scale, because that's what competence does in harsh places. It gives you more to carry, not less. And he carried this weight willingly. His knowledge of the territory became intuitive, visceral. He began to memorize not just the ridgelines, but how a snowdrift behaves under a particular wind after 3 days below zero. He paid attention to the snowpack like a doctor listening to a heart, searching for weaknesses, murmurs, warning signs. Friends, more familiar with comfort than risk, watched his choices from afar and wondered what he was running from. But the truth was always simpler and more demanding. He was running from nothing. He was moving toward something, toward a version of himself that resembled the man he wanted to become. Then came a turning point, a job that would radically change his way of apprehending danger. Starting in 1988, Marty entered the fight against brush fires. He learned the behavior of fire as he had learned that of ice, by getting close enough to get burned, but staying far enough away to learn. This job has nothing glamorous about it. It is heavy, relentless, governed by primal forces that do not negotiate. You earn your place through sweat and silence, period. And he earned his. In 1994, he became a smoke jumper with the Alaska Fire Service. He survived a physically and mentally grueling selection process from which only a tiny fraction of candidates graduate. In the end, he would record 337 jumps over 114 missions. You do this job for the same reason you run a trapline at -40°C. Because it is honest. Because the mind must be entirely present, without distraction. Because risk teaches a form of focus that comfort will never teach. And he did not stop flying once the fire season ended. On the contrary, that's when he truly began. Alaska is a country of airplanes, and Marty became a bush pilot not for the prestige, but for the reach, the freedom of access. A Super Cub can drop you on a gravel bar where a helicopter wouldn't even attempt to land. Flying here is a permanent lesson in humility. It is having to calculate under pressure, treating every gust, every whim of the clouds as if they were trying to communicate something important. Gradually, the boundary between the work that pays the bills and the work that keeps you alive blurred. The two merged into one long season, paced by the weather, the miles, and that particular deep fatigue that proves, more than anything, that you are fully alive. Constantly, he maintained a moment-to-moment distrust of shortcuts. He set his lines with clockmaker's precision, repaired what gave way under pressure, and constantly calculated how far he could push his luck before fate turned against him. Meanwhile, other team members were carving their own survival stories, scattered between Montana, North Carolina, and Kodiak Island. But it was Marty's solo expeditions, his long treks in biting cold, repairs made with numb and nearly insensible fingers, those perilous flights to check remote traps that gripped the audience's heart. He offered the public an open window into an existence both ordinary and extreme, when you are the one living it from the inside. And above all, he showed them something rare, a home. With his wife, Dominique, he had transformed a hostile landscape into a private, coherent universe, filled with meaning. Their daughter, Noah Jane, made all these stakes suddenly very concrete. Marty wasn't a man playing at being a mountaineer. He was a family man deliberately building a life meant to teach his child what true competence looks like, when conditions leave you no other choice. He taught her how to help on the trapline, how to drive a snowmobile with discernment rather than bravado, and above all, how to feel the subtle difference between the fear you listen to and the fear you must fight. The show offered the world a form of silent pride, without the slightest fanfare. And an audience gathered not only around the work, but around the core values that made it possible. Here, the dangers were never decorative. They were the very heart of the narrative. One day, while flying his bush plane over a desolate stretch of Alaska, the aircraft suddenly nosedived. Without the slightest warning, without a possible mayday, without anyone to call for help. Only gravity and the passage of time. Marty stabilized the plane, set it down where he could, then moved from one solution to the next with that calm urgency particular to men who know the only help available is what they can fashion with their own hands. Stranded without proper equipment, he spent the night in an isolated cabin, rationing his calories and his warmth, like a man who knows exactly what a falling thermometer can inflict on a human body. When he shifted some of his winter travel to snowmobiles, he had to learn another limit just as inflexible. Without at least 4 inches of fresh snow, the heat exchanger overheats and the machine ends up cooking itself from the inside. So, he would stop mid-journey, pack handfuls of snow by hand against the burning metal, and set off again. This is the essential difference between drama and discipline. Drama demands applause. Discipline wants only one thing, to be able to do it again tomorrow. In 2013, he hosted the writer Bill Evans for a winter that punished impatience severely. Evans got lost in the thickets. In a cold so intense it turned one's breath into a cloud of regrets. He managed, at the last minute, to light a fire. Marty found him, and Dominique's simple but inflexible rule, never leave the cabin without a lighter and paper, suddenly took on the authority that only reality confers. This episode was less a rescue story than a lesson. Competence always looks calm, and it is what saves lives. For what nature takes, it never gives back. The wilderness does not settle its debts with money. Collects them in time, in effort, and in friends. In 2017, Mountain Man lost far more than a cast member with the death of Preston Roberts. It lost an essential link in that chain of men who turn hard work into a form of pure goodness. An inoperable lung tumor, a body that faded in just a few days, and that sudden, heavy silence that follows the departure of a man who always gave far more than he took. It shook the entire community, because it gave a name, a face, to a fear they all carried within them. Here, physical strength is not a guarantee, and if you go, it will be quick. The work left unfinished, however, must still be done. Marty is not a man of many words, but he wrote a tribute that stated clearly what Preston represented. For men like him, competence and generosity are not two separate qualities. They are one and the same. And he contributed to that collection which, in just 5 weeks, raised over $100,000 to complete the roof Preston was still working on. Working for your family doesn't change the fact of the loss, but it changes everything about how you carry what remains. Grief falls differently on men accustomed to operating under pressure. They don't break their schedules, they break their assumptions. It makes the next snowstorm heavier. Not because the snow is deeper, but because you now understand what can go wrong and how fast. Marty had known other frights before. Kodiak bear tracks that make you weigh your next step twice. Mechanical failures in a blizzard that turn an itinerary into a giant question mark. A plank slamming down on his shoulder and back during a cabin repair. An accident that could have ended a season in an instant. But it was the funeral that moved the ground beneath his feet. You begin to see your life not as a series of accomplishments, but as a set of responsibilities. What you owe to those waiting for you back at camp. What you owe to the child learning to be brave without being reckless. Marty never really raised his voice against outside criticism, those pressures that approached his trapping with the indifference of those for whom a practice is either legal or it is not, with no consideration for its cultural and historical roots. Some viewers were convinced reality TV was necessarily scripted, but he only responded to what deserved a response. He trapped in strict compliance with Alaska's regulations on seasons and species. He chose equipment designed to minimize animal suffering. He did the work as the law and his conscience allowed. Then he returned to his trapline, because arguing is not a survival skill. Listening, however, is one. Yes. Knowing how to judge the next cloud on the horizon. Absolutely. Knowing when to stop, more than anything. When grief finally settled in him, like a scar that would never leave, His daughter was 13. And the calculation, once so complicated, suddenly became starkly simple. Putting yourself in danger is one thing. Letting a camera turn your child's childhood into mere content to be consumed is another. He chose silence. In 2019, after 8 seasons of Mountain Man, Marty Meierotto told his viewers that he was done. There was no tearful staging, no cryptic hints. He said what needed to be said, with the sober restraint he was known for. He did not want his daughter to grow up under the constant lens of cameras, to learn to calibrate her days according to the needs of an episode, or to watch the life she was living through the distorting mirror of an audience. He wasn't leaving the wilderness, which he cherished more than anything. He was leaving the deafening noise of fame. This choice sent a minor shockwave through all those who had built weekly rituals around his constancy, his reassuring presence on their screens. But for the man who had measured risk and reward since he first knew how to read a track in the snow, this was merely the culmination of the simplest of calculations. If you are lying on your deathbed, you will not think of the money you made or your professional title. You will think of what you did with your life and, above all, for whom you did it. For Marty, this sentence was not a mere figure of speech. It was a final declaration, a verdict that explained the judgment of his heart. He did not make the rounds of talk shows to justify himself. He did not open a social media account to maintain the Mountain Man brand. He simply walked off the stage and picked up the thread of the life he had always wanted. To trap on his own terms, to fly by his own instincts when it truly matters, to raise a daughter capable of distinguishing a sky that warns from a sky that merely worries. In a small Alaskan town, far from shooting schedules and the strange temptations of even minor celebrity, he did what he had done in 1985, with an old truck and a plan that fit in the glove compartment. He chose the land. He chose silence. For the fans who always wanted more, this silence took on the aura of mystery. Rumors always hunt silence, precisely because silence does not answer. But those close to him knew there was nothing complicated about it. The man who never confused attention with purpose had simply stopped offering the world more of his private life than he could afford to give. He wasn't running from the headlines. He was running toward something deeper. Family dinner. A fire banked for dawn. A lesson to impart to a young pilot in the making. A new stretch of trapline that would demand more judgment than adrenaline. The cameras were gone. But the critics, they don't just disappear like that. The debates over animal rights remained what they had always been. Loud, moralizing, and often strangely blind to human context. And that nagging question of whether a show exaggerated problems or not, it remained unresolved, especially for those convinced that reality TV never tells the truth. But Marty, he answered the only questions that truly mattered. Not with words, but by living in a way that made the answers obvious. He obeyed the laws, period. He treated the animals and that immense land with the respect owed by a true professional. He kept his claims modest and his work meticulously accurate. Those who understood him needed no further proof. Those who did not understand him, well, no speech could have convinced them anyway. The tragedy that hangs over his story is not a melodramatic twist. He did not die out there, in the crush of a plane or the silence of a storm. No, he did something far more difficult. He left when staying would have been, on paper, so much easier. He turned his back on continuous attention and easy money to protect the most fundamental right of all, that of a child to grow up shielded from the lens. And he accepted what that costs, in a world that forgets you the moment you cease to be part of its daily landscape. What remains after all that? There exists a particular kind of peace, a rough-hewn serenity that is won only by fiercely refusing to betray oneself. The years that followed his final episode did not make headlines, and that was precisely the point. He continued to trap because that ancestral rhythm defined him. He continued to fly because Alaska speaks a language that only makes sense at 500 feet and 40 knots. He continued to pass on his knowledge, because knowledge that isn't shared eventually becomes anecdotal, and then it dies. He showed Noah how to make a decision the way a pilot learns to do it. Calmly, early, and always with a margin of safety. He did not owe the world spectacular news. He owed his family his simple presence. The difference between those two obligations is precisely the difference between being known and being whole. When you stop performing, the days become ordinary again, but in a way that keeps you alive. Fix the problem while it's still small. Count the fuel before it runs low. Read the weather without the filter of commentary. The work is quieter, but not easier. More modest, but no less important. He built and maintained everything he needed, and he chose to stop explaining it to the world. Because explanation is an economy in itself, a currency of exchange, and he had already contributed enough. If there is a sadness in this story, it lies in that immense gap between what a camera can capture and what a life truly demands. Viewers saw him avert disaster more than once, ration warmth and judgment in the same breath, and bury friends who were simply too young to go. They saw a man choose family over glory. But what they could not see, what no one has any interest in showing, are the countless, unfilmed acts of restraint and quiet care that make survival not only possible, but worth living. The decision to turn back, even when pride orders you forward. The extra hour spent teaching his daughter to read a sky that can sometimes lie. The quiet acceptance that some stories are simply not meant for an audience, but only for the people who live them. Marty Meierotto was never a brand. He was a trapper, a firefighter, a smoke jumper, a pilot, a husband, a father. The wilderness offered him a life he could respect, and it exacted a price he was willing to pay. The show offered him a platform and, ultimately, a problem he simply refused to accept. The choice he made then was not a retreat. It was a return to the land that told him the truth first, and to the family that remains the only measure that truly matters in the end. But beyond the feat, what strikes you about Marty's story is what happened after. Because he, specifically, chose to leave the spotlight. While he was at the peak of his glory, having literally survived hell and written one of the most incredible pages in aviation, he simply disappeared. He turned his back on the honors, the interviews, the fame. He went home to Montana and he raised his cows. He chose silence after the roar of the jet engines. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson. True greatness does not always reside in the glare of the spotlight, but sometimes in the quiet shade where one cultivates their inner peace. Marty reminds us of the importance of private life, that sanctuary where love, grief, and rebuilding can unfold far from the tumult and the applause. There are men who become legends by staying in the limelight long enough. He, Marty Martinez, became a legend by having the extraordinary courage to leave it in time. He did it for his daughter, to give her a normal life, far from the trauma and the cameras. After brushing against death so often, he chose life, simplicity. He preferred the fields of Montana to the hushed halls of Washington. And in making that choice, he wrote the final line of his legend, not with a heroic act, but with a humble and profoundly human decision. So I ask you this: which part of his story touches you the most? Is it those repeated near accidents, that macabre ballet with death that defies all logic? Is it the grief and the resilience in the face of losing his crewmates, that pain he had to overcome in silence? Or is it precisely that ultimate decision, that renunciation of glory to prioritize what is essential? His family, his peace, his daughter? Each of these chapters resonates differently. Tell me about it in the comments. I'm really looking forward to reading you. And if these life stories, these choices that define an existence, these extraordinary destinies fascinate you, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories.